attempts at regulation, some of which democratically inclined, works quite well, some of which at the behest of authoritarians seeking to constrict the ability of people to use these tools to make their voices heard. That means that as we approach these conversations within our own countries, there's massive impact on everyone. And so I'm grateful that we get to do this work and have these conversations in partnership with those that have rolled up their sleeves and really gotten into the mix to figure out how we do this right. And a big component of the conversation on how to govern technology responsibly is having a better understanding of exactly what's going on. And so that's how we get to conversations on transparency, on data access. And that is why we are so very lucky to be joined today by the people that we have. The reason we're having this particular event right now, however, is that Naomi and her team at the Oversight Board, after having a number of years of getting to see data from Meta, as well as experimenting with a model of oversight and accountability, of feedback, of information, put together a really impressive report that was just published in the Journal of Online Trust and Safety, called Burden of Proof, Lessons Learned for Regulators from the Oversight Board's Implementation Work. It is the first of its kind report on a first of its kind organization. And we are lucky to have someone as knowledgeable and experienced as Naomi helping walk through that. So I'm going to pass to her momentarily to walk us through the main takeaways of the research that they conducted. And then we'll come back for a conversation with folks that are right now trying within the European Union and within the UK to figure out how to responsibly set standards for these new regulations coming online, so that we all might have a better sense of how our online world works. And with that, I will say thank you to Naomi for helping to put this together and joining us, and pass it to you for much more insightful comments than my introduction. Thank you, Naomi.
Thank you so much, Rose. Yeah, just to kick off, I wanted to say thank you so much to the Atlantic Council and to Rose, Chloe, and Bradine for being here today. I want to just share some insights from this paper and in the hopes that it'll help seed this conversation. So just as a brief overview, the board is an independent body made up of experts versed in human rights, freedom of expression, and digital rights. It has oversight over individual pieces of content for Meta and can also make non-binding policy recommendations. So when the board makes these recommendations, Meta does have to respond publicly. We have some best practices that we've developed and that we cover in this paper around how to write recommendations in such a way that the intent is really understood, and that we have sort of an ongoing dialogue with Meta about the implementation of those recommendations. So recommendations should include an expected measure of implementation, right? The board will consider this implemented when X, Y, Z happens. Recommendations need to ask for one specific change rather than making compound requests. And we have continuous opportunities to clarify the intent with Meta, and we'll get into that in just a moment. But the real key here is that similar to regulation, like the DSA, like the Online Safety Act, we need some form of measurement to know if these recommendations are actually being implemented and if they have the intended impact. So we evaluate Meta's responses and implementation in two ways. So after every set of recommendations that Meta responds to, we'll publicly evaluate whether Meta actually acknowledged and addressed all components of the recommendation, whether they provided a concrete timeline for action, and whether they actually committed to concrete action. And through this public evaluation process, we have seen Meta's responses include more of these components over time, get more comprehensive over time. The second way that we evaluate implementation is that we look at whether we have proof, right? Rather than taking Meta's word for it, if Meta says, yes, we've implemented this recommendation, we look for proof that they actually have. And the paper goes in depth on that methodology, but just on a high level, I'll say that of all recommendations that Meta has closed, right, meaning they're no longer responding to those recommendations, either because they say they have implemented them or because they have declined to implement them, 41% of these, we have either full or we have proof of either full or partial implementation. 30% of the recommendations Meta has declined to implement. They've reframed it or they've omitted it. Mostly they've declined to implement them. And for the other 29%, Meta says it's implemented the recommendation, but we don't yet have proof. So again, by publicly evaluating, we are seeing more and more recommendations that we actually can get proof of implementation for. In the paper, we lay out the ways that we request data and the type of data that we tend to request. So this is just a few examples. I'm just showing this to highlight that we go in depth. I'll give one example from this table. So there was a recommendation about linking a specific rule in the hate speech community standard prohibiting blackface. So being very clear about what the rule for prohibiting blackface is. And we asked for data on the blackface policy violation rate across markets and languages before and after the recommendation was implemented. So that's just one example. We lay out many more examples in the paper. And in general, the way that we think about what data exists are also laid out in a table. This is just one part of that table, but I encourage you to check it out in the paper. So for example, if we look at what's in transparency reporting, Meta's public transparency reporting, at a much less aggregated level, we can expect that Meta will have interaction volume, so likes, shares, views on a piece of content. It'll have metadata, including the timestamps, the actors, the locations of folks that are interacting with content, et cetera. So again, this is just sort of a high-level overview, but do encourage you to check out the paper more in depth. And lastly, I'll just go into a few case studies. Again, we go in depth in the paper, but this is some examples of how data demonstrating implementation and impact has gotten better over time. So in one of the board's earlier cases, it looked at indigenous artistic expression that was erroneously flagged for violating the hate speech policy. We requested an accuracy assessment for the hate speech classifier, right? So the automated tooling that flags whether a piece of content is violating the hate speech policy. We specifically asked for an accuracy assessment of that classifier regarding artistic expression in our indigenous communities. What we received instead was an overall hate speech classifier accuracy metric, so not specific to artistic expression in indigenous communities. The learning there for us was Meta is not going to track something that impacts such a marginalized community. Often it's that Meta improve its identification of content that would be flagged for violating the nudity policy, but should have been accepted because it is relating to medical imagery in the context of breast cancer. So what we requested was the reduction of false positive identification of violating content. So how much less content was falsely identified as being violating as a result of these improvements. What we received was a specific number over a 30-day period. So it was actually over two 30-day periods, 3,500 pieces of content were routed for human review rather than being automatically removed due to classifier improvements. So this was an improvement over the previous case. We got some very specific numbers. We got a set time period. We got proof of impact from these improvements. We did not get the underlying data, but it was an improvement on a high-level metric. And then the last case that I'll go into is a case where the board recommended, and this was in the context of two users sort of fighting in the comments on a post that was in support of Alexei Navalny, the recently deceased Russian opposition leader. The board recommended that users be sort of warned before they post potentially violating content that their content might be potentially violating, and that they get the opportunity to edit that content and not violate the policy. So Meta implemented this recommendation. We requested the count and percent of content preserved following user amendments to post. What we received was over a 12-week period that 17 million notifications were sent for bullying and harassment violations. over 100 million pieces of content total, and 20% of users chose to delete their posts. So we are seeing a change in user behavior as a result of being notified that they may be violating this policy and being given the opportunity to change. So you can see that over time, we are getting more and more concrete impact metrics. It's over longer periods of time. It's getting more specific. We have a long way to go, but really hoping that this can be useful to regulators as they are getting their metrics and transparency work underway. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. And my little nerd heart is so excited to dig in, but just a genuine statement of kudos to you for taking really important lessons in an experiment that honestly, I don't think anyone else has had the chance to try and curate that into insights that it's not just the regulator community, but frankly, all of independent research and those trying to better understand the digital space to be able to dig into. I want to introduce then the people that we're joined by on screen now, and then I want to come back for some questions first, Naomi, to you on the report, and then moving into a broader conversation. You know, the reason that we are having this conversation on this very specific report is, as I mentioned, this is kind of an interesting moment in time. We had, in the last year and a half, the European Union's Digital Services and Digital Markets Act passed and come into force, which is a pretty significant and comprehensive approach to trying to set standards and rules in a democratically aligned way for the management of our digital spaces within the European Union. We also, this past fall, had the passage of the UK's Online Safety Act in October, and their regulator, referred to as Ofcom, is in the process of now, based on that law, setting the standards of how they go about implementing the requirements that they've been given. And so we're in this moment of active experimentation and active conversation on perhaps the most consequential standards that will be set for everyone to follow as we move forward. And so the two people that you see on screen, first, I'm excited to introduce Berdine van der Donk at the European Commission's what's referred to as DG Connect, responsible for implementing and setting all of these guidelines for the European Commission's Digital Services and Digital Markets Act. Berdine leads the transparency and content moderation work at the Commission and will have a wealth of information for us as they move forward in their process slightly ahead of the UK. For the UK, we are joined by Chloe Colliver, who is currently the head of industry developments for online safety and has a long history in civil society looking at these issues as well, previously with the organization ISD. With that, though, I want to quickly come back to what we just heard from Naomi. And I'm curious, because one of the things that you got into was picking and choosing case studies and questions to interrogate. And if you even take a step back from that, even just having a sense of what it is you're trying to collect or examine is a really significant challenge in a world awash with data. And so I'm curious, Naomi, and we'll start with you and then frankly move forward to our other speakers. What do you make of what has appeared to be the most valuable information that you've seen? And are there things that surprised you? Information and data you thought would be extremely useful and turned out not to be as helpful or insightful, and vice versa, other things you didn't realize would be really important to your understanding of dynamics?
Definitely, it's a great question. I'll start with the latter. So when we requested the hate speech accuracy classifier metric, I think that was an exciting moment because it was essentially bringing to the public, right? These are the underlying tools that are making, help ranking basically, right, and making decisions within the platform, and that users often see as these sort of shadowy, right, or sort of underlying things. So it was very exciting to be able to say, look, this is the way that these decisions are made in an automated way. But fundamentally, when we got that metric, it wasn't that useful, right? It was accuracy. There was no precision, right? So just for layperson's terms, accuracy is how often are we correctly identifying or how sure are we, excuse me, that the thing that we're identifying actually matches the category? And then precision is, out of a large group of items, how often are we correctly identifying all of those items, right? And so we only got one half of that equation. We didn't get the other side of the equation. It only tells half the story. And so I think that we hoped that that would be more useful, and ultimately without the underlying data, without the other side of that equation, the precision, it wasn't that useful. In terms of what has been really useful, I found the user behavior changes in the Pro-Navalny case, the last case study I shared, to be really interesting, right? We're actually seeing user behavior change as a result of notifications, as a result of platforms giving them the opportunity, right, the informed opportunity to change behavior. And often we hope that by providing more transparency, users will do something different, but we very rarely actually get to see the outcome of that. So that's definitely high on the list for me.
Thank you. That's fascinating. Berdine, I wonder if I can go to you next. And the DSA is a little bit farther ahead in the process, but it's this interlocking program of risk assessments and audits feeding into enforcement, and underpinning all of that are questions of what information you're getting from platforms. I'm curious in that if you can speak a little bit to the different purposes you're thinking of in trying to even contemplate where to start on what you need from a platform as a regulator, as well as what you want the broader community of practice, including entities like the Oversight Board and independent researchers, to have access to make your regulation work in the way intended.
Yes, definitely. So first of all, thank you very much for having the opportunity to join here today and to also discuss with these fabulous colleagues in the field to actually strive to obtain the same goal. So as you mentioned already in the intro, Rose, what we're actually trying to do is to better understand what's going on and what's going on behind these former black boxes of online platforms and service providers. So what the DSA would like to do is to create accountability through transparency. So that's what we see in the main tools. And I think in that, if you look at the work that the Oversight Board has now done and presented in the paper, one of the biggest problems was not for us currently obtaining the data, but determining what the data should be. So in that sense, the DSA outlines different tools of transparency to create as much of an insight and as much of shedding light into this black box. So we see then, for example, that we have mandatory transparency reports, not only for online platforms, but also for all service providers. We have a transparency database where anyone can live follow what types of content moderation decisions are being taken. And I think either today or one of these days, we will hit 15 billion reasonings for content moderation decisions. So that is since it has been online in September. So that is half a year, 15 billion decisions. And then, of course, we have data access. So that is for researchers to look more in depth into what is going on behind the scenes in these platforms. But I think in general, if we link it back to the question that you asked before to Naomi, what has proven most useful and also what has proven not to be most useful? We, of course, these blunt numbers to say, well, we have 15 billion decisions. Initially, I didn't think that this would be something that would be so changing in the minds of what we're looking at with online platforms. But now we can see that the problems are way more systemic than what we initially thought. There's no way that we can address this in the way that we have looked at traditional, perhaps crime or illegality, because of the sheer number of sharing of content online. So I think that for us has been one of the eye-opening, most useful data points. And I think on the opposite side, what has proven not very useful, at least what we now can see from the first round of transparency reports, for example, but also something that we see perhaps in the risk assessments that we are currently looking at, is that platforms interpret very differently the different measurements and the different metrics in the DSA. So in that sense, I think to create the most transparency and also opportunity for accountability, we need some kind of standardization. So that's what we're currently working at, but also what we, of course, look at what our colleagues are doing at Ofcom, but also the Oversight Board. We take inspiration from how we can optimize these metrics.
That's really interesting, and I want to come back to the 15 billion decisions that you referenced in a moment. But Chloe, you guys are right now in the mix of kind of running through this long iterative process, and I'm curious what it is that you're taking from the lessons of folks that are grappling with this now, and how that's influencing how you're approaching questions of what data to prioritize, as well as I know that there are differences between what the UK law and the EU law are actually enabling and focusing on in these realms. But if you can speak a little bit to how you guys are walking into this moment as well.
Absolutely. Thanks, Rose, and thanks to Atlantic Council for having us all here today. It's wonderful to be part of this panel. Just to give a bit of background, so Ofcom is due to publish its first consultation on our transparency regime in this summer. So please do keep your eyes peeled for that. So we're learning a lot from both other regulators, civil society, experts like the Oversight Board, in thinking through not only exactly what will we be asking for from different services, but how we ask those questions and for that information in the most effective way possible. And I think what Naomi touched on in terms of asking the questions in the way that gets you the answers that you're expecting is a huge part of that challenge. I'd look broadly at sort of the international community that's been doing work on this area to speak a bit about how we're being influenced and inspired in our own thinking around this. I'll mention the E-Safety Commissioner in Australia as an example. They've been conducting transparency reporting under their regulatory regime for some time now, and it's been really helpful to watch how that has developed, how they've had to tailor some of their notices and questions to different services to make sure that they get the most impact from the questions they're asking, and some of the challenges they've faced in getting that information back from services, whether for kind of process-oriented reasons or for kind of strategic or commercial sensitivity reasons. So lots of really useful and interesting experiences from regulators who've already been doing this. And similarly, as Badine mentioned, the first round of DSA transparency reports, there was some really interesting content in there, I thought, around content moderators and resourcing and languages. And this is an area that Ofcom is able to, within its powers, ask about. We have a kind of whole remit of questions we are able to ask about governance. So that might include staffing, resourcing, processes, and decision-making. And that's quite a new area for transparency reporting. So we're really interested in some of those slightly novel areas that can really deliver new insight and information to civil society, to the media, to the broader public, who are really the end users of these transparency reports in an ideal world. So a lot to draw on from the community, but equally a new challenge. And one of the differences that Ofcom has in its transparency setup compared to the Digital Services Act in the EU is that we are able to tailor our transparency notice to each individual service that we send them to. Losing my lights in this room. Tailor our transparency notices to each individual service. So there's this balance we're really trying to think about here of the value of comparability. So where you do have standardization across the industry and you're able to look across different types of services to understand patterns and trends, but also the value of being able to tailor metrics, definitions, and questions to specific services or service types. So you might think about search engines versus user-to-user social media services. And we might want to think about how are we going to ask for questions or metrics in a really precise way that delivers the information that's most relevant for those types of services. So that's a lot of what we're trying to factor in. There's a couple of other factors as well I'm happy to talk about later in the discussion around capacity, user base, and functionalities that we have to consider as a regulator in how we're asking questions and what we're asking.
Thank you. You brought up, Chloe, the kind of dynamic of scoping the questions appropriately. And I think there's this really interesting tension. And I should say, like in our broader transparency community, sometimes we get a little prickly about communicating the difference between data access and data, and then transparency as a concept. So I don't want to lose the thread on those two different pieces. Naomi, one of the things that is very interesting about the report that you just put out is it does speak to the lessons that you learned in diving into, okay, I asked for this from the platform. This was not helpful. They didn't know how to comply with it. I assessed then what I could change about how I am making these requests and tweaked along the margins. I wonder if you can speak a little bit to balancing that kind of approach that is pretty resource intensive and specific to a platform with finding what those steady state kind of core data questions are that are essential to you even knowing how to do that sort of scoping on a platform by platform basis.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I would really point to the table that I showed briefly with, how we think about what data exists. So all platforms are going to be tracking things, right? Depend what if it's a search engine, they're going to be tracking, right? Like how many people are clicking on various links, right? From which locations, if folks are signed in, right? If you're looking at like Chrome and the Google search engine, but all revenue generating platforms, whether they're peer-to-peer search engines, marketplaces, will be tracking that. And based on what you can see on the front page of those or within the platform, right, you can sort of guess what they're going to be tracking. And I think that's something that we've also gotten a lot better at over time. So I think that having a core understanding of, if I ask for this, does it apply to the majority of the user base? Probably they're tracking it. Does this tie to revenue? Probably they're tracking it, right? And having that as sort of the place that you're starting from, as opposed to starting from, well, in an ideal world, they would be tracking the impact on this like really small community, like, and they'd be doing really nuanced moderation at scale. That becomes really resource intensive, right? And you're asking for new tracking, and you're asking for a platform to, in the case of the wampum belt case that I mentioned earlier, to be basically tracking the like racial identity, right? Or self-reported racial identity of users, which becomes really challenging for a lot of reasons, for legal reasons, right? So for me, I think the main learning is starting from that place of what is most likely to be tracked, and then tweaking around the edges of, how am I making sure that the threshold for implementation, that the threshold for compliance is correctly stated? And I think that's really been our biggest learning.
That's really interesting to hear. And I know, Chloe, you also brought up the example of languages. And so I wonder, Berdine, we had dug into that as well. Just I think the entire community getting this first round of information that we've never before really been able to have access to, and trying to see what we can learn from it. And so we took the question, and to be clearer on this, one of the aspects of transparency reports from the DSA required companies to report on their content moderation language capabilities on European Union official languages. And every single company kind of approached that differently. All of you have referenced so far in your answers how variable company interpretation of requests are. And so I'm curious, based on that, I can say what we felt we learned, and the questions that we had that weren't just about accountability, but even what is the right question to ask or interest to have in responsible language capacity for a company operating or a platform operating globally. I'm curious, for the commission, was there anything that you took from those transparency reports, without getting into specifics, but that is changing how you're thinking about either risk assessments for the next round, an approach to auditing, just kind of changing how you're thinking about systemic risk or the regulation itself?
Yes, so that's an amazing question. So if we look, for example, at this data point of languages, so one of the things that this allows us to see as the regulator is how well does a platform perform in different member states, to the sense that if we're dealing with systemic risk, so in the DSA, very large online platforms have the obligation to map the risks of systemic risks. So one of them is, for example, the dissemination of illegal content. Well, if in one of the languages of the European Union, you do not have any content moderators, then it's highly unlikely, if there is illegal content in that language, that you will be able to mitigate that risk and that you will be able to take it offline. So in that sense, by having information on the languages spoken by all the different content moderators for different platforms, we as a regulator get an insight into what is actually going on that platform, and why perhaps some of the measures that they have in place to mitigate illegal content and the spread thereof on their platforms is not functioning well. So in that sense, it allows us to dig deeper into some of the compliance issues that might be going on the platform. And I think one of the very important things to highlight here for the DSA is that it's not only useful for us as the regulator. So one of the key achievements, I think, from the DSA is that these transparency reports, but also the database and the access for researchers, is available to the public. So it's not only that it gives us access as the regulator to check for compliance, it also gives the general population access to scrutiny over what these platforms are actually doing, and to see, hey, in Danish or in Maltese, they only have 1 or even 0 content moderators. What is going on? And to ask questions whether you are a journalist or a researcher or just a person discussing perhaps with their friends, I'm not sure if only I do this with my friends, to say, hey, what is going on with social media platforms? Should we actually accept this?
That's great. Chloe, I'm curious, building on that, how has seeing those transparency reports come out affected how you're thinking about that balance between information to enable you to do your job and enforce a regulation versus information for this broader community to be able to make use of it? And again, just noting that you spent a good portion of your career in the outside community, now coming in. Any insights on where that kind of ecosystem approach enables one or the other through these processes?
Absolutely. I'd make 2 points there, and one is about transparency reporting, so operational transparency reporting, which is what we focused on the most, and one is about research access to data, which I'll come on to second. In terms of transparency reporting, we're really trying not to think about transparency reporting as simply a compliance exercise under the Online Safety Act. So what we're trying to do is make sure that the information that we're asking services to provide itself has an impact on safety measures and safety practices at platforms, so that the act of requiring information disclosure has a powerful lever or pressure for change in itself. So that's the way we're thinking about it. And of course, that requires also some element of challenge from external review of that information, or to make sure that we're asking companies to look in a new place or think about a new topic or think about things in a slightly different way than perhaps they have previously in their own voluntary reporting. There's also really an ask of us as a regulator in how we make that information as usable and useful to external parties and experts as possible. And it's something we're thinking about quite a lot at the moment in the run up to our first consultation on transparency, is how can we make sure that we're not the only people who are looking at these reports and digging in and trying to understand the stories there, but that information is usable, accessible, and informative for either experts or the broader media or public who are also interested in these issues around safety here in the UK. On the second point around researcher access to data, Ofcom has powers to publish a report within 18 months of the Act coming into force about the status quo of researchers' access to data, and then to publish guidance for industry and for researchers on this topic. There's obviously very robust powers under the Digital Services Act that Badine, I'm sure, can talk about if there are questions concerning researchers' access to data, which have already come into force. I think what's really interesting here is this gives an opportunity for external researchers or expert bodies to think more longitudinally and programmatically about the kind of information and data that they can put together that can help to audit or sense check or assess what we're hearing from platforms themselves. So I think these two tools together create almost a pincer movement that can be very powerful, which allows regulators on the one hand via service providers and external experts on the other through researcher access to data to be looking at these from slightly different angles and to be making sure that we're able to quality assure to some extent the data and the information that we're receiving from platforms. So I do see it as a kind of ecosystem approach. I think there's hopefully going to be a lot of very interesting and meaningful information coming out of the raft of transparency reports we're able to produce under the Online Safety Act and the Digital Services Act and other regulatory regimes. But it will take more than just the regulators ourselves to really dig into that and find the stories and find the insights that really drive change.
Thanks. Everyone has kind of hit on the edges of one of the tensions that I think a lot of people in the community are focused on, which is a lot of what we've learned to this point has come from, as you mentioned, voluntary practices and disclosures. And as imperfect as that ecosystem obviously was, it did engender a fair amount of collaboration and I'll say innovation. The people were trying things and iterating and learning. The minute that things get moved into a regulatory or compliance context, that can change some of those dynamics. And so I'm curious if, Naomi, you've operated in this kind of interstitial space of understanding data of platforms, both within and outside platforms for some time, whether you're seeing any changes as the DSA comes into force and the UK prepares to implement its bill, and how platforms are approaching these questions, or how that sort of sharing and information across these different sectors is working.
Yeah, so I think, it was in the news last week that CrowdTangle is being shut down in August, and that moving of research institutions, nonprofit newsrooms, and I believe some civil society organizations over to the meta content library is really beginning. I think in the case of Meta, right, we are seeing that it's sort of a trade-off, right? There's a pullback of this voluntary tool that for-profit newsrooms relied on very heavily as well for over a decade. On the flip side, this tool that is being built, I believe, for compliance, right, with DSA Article 40.12, does include data and does include a broader scope of data than was provided via CrowdTangle, right? So we are seeing the benefits of the regulatory approach and the sort of pressure to provide a certain standard. When you look at other platforms, when you look at X, Twitter, for example, there's a massive pullback on the fire hose, right, or sort of the gold mine, the sort of gold standard for research. That was true for a decade as well. And it remains to be seen how they're going to comply with 40.12. I think it sort of shows how much is still reliant on the goodwill of platforms, and that regulation alone sometimes is pulling people kicking and screaming across the line. So I think it's been interesting to see the change. And I do think that, again, in terms of the types of data that's being provided, the meta content library is going to have comments on public posts, which is something that when I was at CrowdTangle was something that we were trying to get for researchers the entire time that I was there and never succeeded. And now it's going to be a part of this new tool, which for me is really exciting. So, we're seeing the trade-off, and I guess we'll see how it continues to play out across other platforms as well.
That's excellent. I'm curious for both Chloe and Berdine, if you can speak a little bit to how you're approaching that tension in setting these standards, and how that connects to obviously international alignment and the implications of one entity asking something of a company and then another entity coming forward and asking a different thing from a company. What is that looking like as you're working through these processes? If you want to start with Chloe and then go to Berdine.
Absolutely. So to start on that international alignment point, our mantra really is kind of align where possible and only diverge where absolutely necessary in terms of some of these challenges that we're facing similarly across jurisdictions. And I think, to me, transparency is an extremely exciting opportunity for international collaboration and cooperation, because there are such specifics that we can get into the weeds of, where we can try to have discussions, definitions, metrics, the timelines and processes for data pipelines at platforms. These are all things that will ideally require some element of discussion and collaboration for them to work best for the regulators, but also for them to be as effective and kind of reasonable as possible for industry. So there's a lot of potential areas and fruitful areas there, I think, for collaboration in the future. And I think networks like the Global Online Safety Regulators Network are potentially a great forum to have some of those informal conversations among common sort of democratic regulators. Further to that, I suppose, on your first question about that challenge of regulatory versus voluntary transparency, I think we see regulatory transparency as a very iterative process. This isn't something that we're going to come out the door with in year one and know exactly what we're going to ask from every service for every year from here until eternity. So to us, it is a kind of engagement process with services to understand, as Naomi was saying, sort of what is actually available at the moment, what do they collect and why, and how we can maybe use some of that knowledge to then incentivize the collection of new metrics over time when we understand these platforms and their incentive structures better, that might help us achieve the safety outcomes that we're really looking for from transparency. So it's going to be a learning process. And I think that means that there isn't such a strict line between regulatory and voluntary transparency efforts, but actually that these things are constantly evolving. And there's a lot we can learn from the voluntary and transparency reporting that's already been happening that will certainly inform the direction of travel that we're going down for regulatory transparency reporting.
That's wonderful. Berdine.
Yes, I can completely agree with what Chloe already explained. And I think to add also a little bit on where the potential is for international alignment and collaboration in line with what Chloe already outlined, is that we have seen quite a lot of arguments when transparency reporting was fully voluntary, that platforms easily would say, we do not track this, or this is a metric that we have no access to, or this is something that we can simply not produce. Where we now see that with this transformation into a regulatory basis for transparency reporting, that we see that actually these metrics were there and we do get access to them. So I think there is also a really good opportunity for collaboration, that if we see that any other institution, whether that is a colleague regulatory body, but also the Oversight Board, for example, or any civil society, has metrics that are important for ensuring accountability and transparency of these online platforms, that is definitely something that in the future will create a more safer internet, and also a more trustworthy online environment that we're looking after. And I think one of the reasons, perhaps highlighting also, that one of the transparency reports that we're asking is also an annual report from trusted flaggers. So we're not only reliant on what platforms themselves say that they are doing on their platforms, we're including different third parties to also ask what they are actually reporting to the platform and how the platform has been responding to them, to see from different angles what actually is going on.
Thank you. I want to ask one more question before we turn to the audience for some questions that have come in. But Berdine, you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation the number of 15 billion statements of reasons for platforms taking content down or addressing content in a certain way. And I'm curious, based on that, you said that was somewhat surprising to you, the kind of what you learned about the extent of systemic issues. One, if you can speak a little bit more to how that changed your thinking, and two, is that changing how you're approaching metrics, transparency, et cetera, through that learning? Well, I'll start there and then have one follow-up.
Yeah, so we had expected that there were a lot of content moderation decisions taken, of course, but then to see that the number is 15 billion within the European Union in half a year, I think is staggering and beyond expectation of how big that number actually was. I think the best way of looking at this number of 15 billion is to line it up with the different numbers that we get from platforms. So through the database that is live, so platforms, every time they take a decision, or at least without undue delay, they submit these statements to the database, so you can see what is going on. We can compare those to the transparency reports that come out every half a year. Are they equal numbers? Do we see anything changing there? Is there anything that changes between these 6 months? And in that sense, they serve different purposes. So where the transparency reports perhaps show a more systemic overview of what is going on, we can see in the database very quickly what happens after certain key events. So that could be an attack in a country, or perhaps elections. We can see what then happens with the content moderation practices on different platforms. So I think in that sense, 15 billion in itself is already staggering, but also the opportunity that we get from seeing live what is going on has been a game changer.
So speaking of that, before we move on, you touch on like just the staggering quantity. So that's both kind of collection and making sense of it for you as well as for others. What are you thinking in terms of how to approach, for lack of a better term, I don't want to say tooling, but how people access this information, kind of the massive burden that means for the entire enterprise of keeping and maintaining data, having access to it in different forms, and if that's changing approaches. And Chloe, same question for you as well, and then we'll turn to the audience.
Yeah, so we've been thinking about this quite a lot, how we can make, of course, this huge amount of data accessible for as many people as possible. So not only people who have a master's degree in data science can get access, but also anyone can see what is going on the platform, because that's the ultimate goal that we would like to achieve, right? That there's more transparency and accountability for everything that happens on the internet. So what the Commission has developed over the last month, and a big compliment to the colleagues that worked very hard on this, is an interface that you can use and you can play around. So you can make actually graphs of the different data sets, so that even people who cannot program themselves can use the data in a way that makes sense for even basic computer skills. So I think that's been one of the key points of us to make this data more accessible.
Chloe.
I mentioned two things from the Ofcom side, specific to the kind of operational transparency reports we've been focusing on. So one is that Ofcom is obliged itself to publish an annual transparency report based on the information that we get from the provider transparency reports. And this is really to try and drive regulators' transparency and to make the insights and the kind of information that is included in those company transparency reports potentially more accessible, compiled in one place, and to really drill into kind of what does that mean for people who maybe don't have the ability, skills, or time to go and dig into every single provider transparency report. So we'll be trying to do some of that what if, so what work at the end of the process to provide an element of insight and kind of analysis on top of the data and the information itself. And the second thing I mention is across all of our work at Ofcom, we're thinking quite closely about things like how can we try and make some of our work more accessible and usable by children, for example, because I think they're a key kind of vulnerable audience under the Online Safety Act. It's one of the key aims of Ofcom's implementation of the Online Safety Act is the protection of children. So there's a lot of work for us to think about and do in terms of how is some of this information and data that we're getting about platforms, their processes, their safety measures, the efficacy of their efforts on safety, how are we making this intelligible and useful for parents, for children, not just for those who might be experts in this space. So that's something we'll be continuing to challenge ourselves on and think about both in our consultation this coming summer, but also much beyond that as we develop the regime further.
Thank you. And I'm excited. We've got a bunch of questions piling in. If you guys have more, please submit it through the link that you have. I'm going to start somewhat connected to the conversation we just had. You had mentioned, Berdine, elections and some of these kind of more intense moments. Oliver Marsh of Algorithm Watch asks, how do you ensure effective data access at a fast pace in a crisis? And if I'm going to add on to that, I know that in the Digital Services Act, there are certain references to not emergency powers, but crisis protocols. And I'm curious how you're thinking about kind of the difference between those sorts of moments, and particularly with the European Union elections coming up, versus the steady state long process of research and understanding that we've been talking about.
Yeah, so very good question. And this is, of course, something that we as the Commission also look into very much. So first, starting perhaps in linking it back to what we started on with the database. So how do we ensure that there's effective data there? After crisis periods, what you will see is that either the different data points will shift. So you can see that either the basis on which data has been removed changes, or you can filter for different types of data in there. If we then shift over to the crisis protocol that you already mentioned a little bit, Rose, and that we look at what the Commission is doing in light of perhaps crisis situations, but also now coming up the European Parliament elections. These are not things that we look at in one moment, of course. We are preparing over months to see how platforms are tackling and how they are preparing for these kinds of situations. And that is including through their risk assessments, but also continuous dialogue. So one of the good things that the DSA allows or has created for the European Commission is that we have a lot of power to ask questions and information from platforms. So even in addition to what is available to the public. So in that sense, we have way more possibility in that sense to ensure that platforms are giving us the necessary data points, but also information to see if they're actually ready to tackle, for example, disinformation in light of the European Parliament elections.
Thank you, Chloe. Can I throw the same question to you?
Absolutely. I think it's a great question and probably touches more on the researcher access to data side than the operational transparency reporting side. Because I think operational transparency reporting isn't built for crisis response, and it's probably never going to be a sort of timely enough mechanism to really provide that kind of insight for people who are looking to respond so quickly to incidents. In terms of researcher access to data, so one of the things that we will be looking at as part of our report on researcher access to data at Ofcom is the different options that are available to platforms in terms of how they provide data to independent researchers and the pros and cons of each of those approaches. And obviously one of those options is API access. And as Naomi touched on, there's been kind of sea changes, I suppose, in the industry over how that is kind of considered and the availability of some of that access at the moment. So I suppose one of the things we'll be able to do as we see some of these knock-on effects of the DSA's Article 40 is in our own report that's due next summer, we'll be able to touch on sort of the pros and cons and the shifting sands of these different approaches to data provision. Who is able to have access in these different models? What are the kind of limitations of the types of data that are provided and that are accessible? How do they differ across services within the industry? To then be able to use that to inform future approaches on researcher access to data for things like crisis response. And I'll just add one more thing, which is, I think, as Badine said, that there is this kind of slew of other regulatory levers and powers that are probably more effective in that time-sensitive manner, but that don't necessarily touch on the question, which was around sort of third-party access to data. I would kind of demonstrate one of our kind of tests and examples of this was around the horrendous attack in Buffalo in New York. We did quite a lot of work in our existing regulatory regime that was established at that point, which was the video sharing platform regulatory regime that regulated video sharing services in the UK. And we were able to work very quickly and constructively with a number of the services where the materials around that attack were shared and live streamed to understand their mechanisms and their efforts around that crisis, and to shed more light, I suppose, on the processes and decision making rather than necessarily the scale or engagement of the content itself. And by being able to pull that kind of regulatory view in combination with the third-party experts who were kind of really excellently doing work, timely work on the kind of scale, engagement, and nature of the spread of that material, we were able to get quite a rounded view of sort of both the process side and the outcome side of that kind of crisis and the material circulating around that crisis. So I would hope that could be used as a model, and it's something we've taken as a lesson and something we hope to learn on in our own crisis response and triage protocols here at Ofcom.
That's fascinating. And I'm glad you brought up the kind of decision-making aspect of this, because when we were doing projects, over the last 2 years of trying to create some common language around what we mean in all of this, calls for transparency and data access, the operational reporting seemed to be a thing that people kept forgetting about and making it sound as simple as possible. Like literally who makes what decisions when inside a company is in and of itself such a foundational aspect to understanding what data then actually matters or what moments of influence and impact are there. And so that's extremely interesting to hear. I'm curious, Naomi, one of the things that you also had a fair amount of insight into is different kinds of media, right? So Chloe just brought in the question of YouTube and of video. There's obviously on X, where we had, as you alluded to, for many, many years when it was Twitter, a lot of good information, but almost entirely in a text context. Are there any lessons on how the kind of dominant form of information changes how you approach the questions you're asking and the information that you're going to want from these platforms?
Yeah, absolutely. I think especially now that we're sort of in the season of generative AI, right, and the format of the core types of misinformation is potentially starting to evolve. I think it is really critical that our transparency focus follows those. So, for example, the board made a recommendation recently that Meta actually needs to expand its manipulated media policy to cover audio and video manipulated media, not just image-based manipulated media or text-based manipulated media, and to label those, right, and to be proactively telling users what you're looking at is potentially manipulated, and potentially have access to a fact check. So I think that's really critical. And the other thing that I'll just say is related to the elections point that we were just discussing. The board had made a recommendation at the end of last year, and that Meta is now implementing, around publicizing the metrics that Meta uses internally to track the effectiveness of its elections integrity work, right? So not only who makes which decisions, but also how is the platform measuring its own success internally is going to be really critical for what types of metrics we will be requesting, and that hopefully regulators will be requesting as well, because those metrics are what platforms are goaling on and what's driving their internal decision making.
Absolutely. I'm imagining every product manager in a company right now crying at the idea of their OKR suddenly being a regulatory standard, and I kind of love it. We're running down on time, but we have another question from the audience related to how external researchers have access to data, and not just the question of API. So we've talked about all of the different purposes for different kinds of information for regulators to be able to make their law work better, their implementation work better. We've talked about the importance of the broader community of practice involved in helping us understand our ecosystem. One of the people watching has called out that in the DSA in particular, there is definitely a focus on project-based approvals for researchers wanting to do important work. But how are you guys thinking about the difference between the kinds of research that like a DFRLab does, which might be shorter form, helps you understand what's emerging as trends in a space fairly quickly, versus highly sensitive, perhaps more data intensive, long form research that gives you a sense over the grand scheme of what's happening online. And this person asked specifically, how can data access rules allow for iterative exploratory research in addition to that more clearly formed academic style research? I'll throw to Chloe first.
Thanks, Rose, and great question. I suppose one advantage of Ofcom perhaps having a kind of step behind the DSA in terms of our work on researcher access is this ability to kind of look widely at the different models that are available for data access and to look at these pros and cons and understand, are some mechanisms for data access for independent researchers more conducive to short-term, immediate responsive work, and are some much more conducive to long-term programmatic studies. And I think that certainly will be the case. And there's, various options that are on the table at a number of companies, from trusted research environments, PETs, APIs, kind of survey data. There's all sorts of things that are potential options in the data sharing market and the data governance approaches that go alongside those. So we'll be taking a kind of open view on that. And there's a lot to be learned in this from other industries that have similar issues around the kind of personal data concerns around the data that we would be dealing with in this kind of field, but also the scale and the nature of that. There's a lot of work from the health sphere, there's a lot of work from the banking sphere and many others where they've tried all sorts of different kinds of models that allow quick time or longitudinal long-term data access. And that will be one of the kind of the balancing points, I suppose, as we assess the different options and models that are available. And we'll be looking closely to the really interesting work that's going on at companies as they comply with their Article 40 obligations under the DSA, to understand what some of those models might look like in practice and how effective they can be for different types of research.
Thank you. Naomi or Berdine, if you want to add anything to that before we go to final thoughts.
Sure. I'll just say briefly that I know that as part of Meta's content library, improvements based on feedback, they are allowing sort of general elections monitoring as a use case. So I think that we are seeing at least some companies start to be responsive to that concern. And again, I think this is a situation where regulation will need to iterate to address that, so that the floor isn't just project-based and leaves out really critical components of the team effort to ensure free and fair elections worldwide.
Thanks, Berdine. Do you have anything you want to add there?
So I think keeping it very short, given the time that we're running out of, the European Commission, in addition to these transparency measures that of course we have, and also the 4012 access for our data researchers, we are in ongoing dialogue with a lot of third parties to present us issues that perhaps we should look into, or specific parts of evidence that they have collected. So that is definitely, if we look more at like this explorative research part, something definitely that we are very happy to collaborate on.
Excellent. And with that, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give us some closing thoughts. It could be a call to action, the one thing you want everyone watching this to walk away with. I'm going to go Chloe, Berdine, and then we will let our report author, Naomi, close us out. Chloe.
Thanks, Rose. Mine is a call to action, which is that Ofcom will be publishing our transparency guidance early this summer, and we're really, really keen to get expert feedback and input on that consultation to make sure that our approach to transparency is as good as it can possibly be, and that it takes into account lots of perspectives. So please do keep an eye out for that, and happy for people to get in touch if they want to understand more. And thanks so much for your time today, everyone.
In light of the call for action, I think what we've only been seeing now is the tip of the iceberg, and I'm looking very much forward to see how all these transparency tools are going to work in practice. So I could just advise and encourage and incentivize anyone listening to try out the tools, go into the database and see what's on there, try to see in the transparency reports what you can find, and to draw up those narratives and stories that perhaps providers do not want to get to the surface.
And I will share a call to action as well. Just an invitation to everyone watching, to regulators especially, if there are particular metrics that
And I should say there are a bunch of questions in the chat that I was not able to get to, and I promise I'm going to pass them on to the panelists, ranging from issues related to human rights questions of those that perhaps live in more sensitive environments, having access to information without burdens of disclosing where they are, to questions of how you know that what you're getting is real and right. And we'll pass it on, but evidence that this is such an important and interesting conversation. I'm so pleased that we were able to do this, and grateful to all of you on the panel for giving of your time in the midst of really doing the hard work on this, and to the audience for joining us and hopefully showing us that there is a community of data access and transparency nerds out there that want to be listening to and engaging in a conversation like this. So with that, I will say thank you, and thank you, Naomi, for bringing us all together. Hope to see you soon.